In 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, a Russian-British economist named Abba Lerner published an article with a provocative title, Functional Finance and the Federal Debt. His thesis was simple and radical. A government that issues its own currency should not worry about the deficit. It should worry about one thing only, the effect of its decisions on the real economy. If there is unemployment, spend more. If there is inflation, spend less. The balanced budget is a superstition. The economics profession ignored him for decades. Until, in the early 21st century, a group of heterodox economists rescued Lerner's ideas, expanded them, and turned them into what is now known as modern monetary theory, or MMT. Its defenders say it is the key to solving unemployment, financing the climate transition, and building a more just society. Its critics say it is a recipe for hyperinflation and institutional collapse. Who is right? Let us find out. In the previous episodes of this season, we have seen the great transformations of the 21st century: the digital economy, digital money, automation, climate change. Each of those challenges requires enormous public resources. And the same question always arises: where does the money come from? The conventional answer is that governments collect taxes, and what they cannot cover with taxes they borrow. MMT says that is fundamentally wrong. That a state with monetary sovereignty does not need to collect before it spends. That the process works in exactly the opposite direction. Today we are going to understand what MMT says, why it is so controversial, and why the debate matters far beyond academia. To understand MMT, you have to start with its intellectual grandfather. Abba Lerner was not a marginal economist. He trained at the London School of Economics, studied with Hayek and with Keynes. And he reached a conclusion that went beyond what Keynes himself dared to formulate. Lerner proposed what he called functional finance. The idea is that fiscal policy should be judged solely by its results, not by whether the budget is balanced. If the economy needs more demand, the government should spend, regardless of the deficit. If the economy is overheating, the government should cut spending or raise taxes, regardless of whether it already has a surplus. The key is that Lerner separated fiscal policy from accounting. The government's goal is not to balance its books like a company. It is to keep the economy at full employment without inflation. The deficit itself is neither good nor bad. What matters is the effect. For decades, this idea was considered interesting but impracticable. Then Warren Mosler, Randall Wray, Stephanie Kelton, and other economists turned it into a complete theoretical framework. Modern monetary theory is built on three central propositions that challenge the conventional view of money and public spending. First proposition: a state that issues its own currency cannot run out of money. The United States issues dollars. Japan issues yen. The United Kingdom issues pounds. These governments cannot go bankrupt in their own currency because they are the ones who create it. When the United States government spends, it does not need to go looking for dollars. It creates them. When it collects taxes, it does not store them in a vault. It destroys them. Public spending creates money. Taxes withdraw it. Second proposition: taxes do not finance spending. In the conventional view, the government collects first and spends second. MMT reverses the sequence. The government spends first, injecting money into the economy, and then collects taxes, withdrawing some of that money. Taxes do not pay for healthcare or roads. What they do is regulate the amount of money in circulation, prevent inflation, and redistribute income. Third proposition: the real constraint is not money, but inflation. If a government can create as much money as it wants, why not create infinite amounts and solve every problem? Because the limit is not financial. It is real. If the government spends more than the economy can produce, prices rise. If there are idle factories and unemployed workers, the government can spend without generating inflation because it is mobilizing idle resources. But if the economy is running at full capacity, every extra euro of public spending pushes prices up. Inflation, not the deficit, is the traffic light. One of MMT's most powerful analytical tools is sectoral balance accounting, developed by Wynne Godley at the University of Cambridge. The idea is simple but revealing. Every economy is divided into three sectors: the public sector, the private sector, and the foreign sector. What one sector overspends is exactly what another sector oversaves. It is pure accounting. If the government runs a deficit, that deficit is exactly the surplus of the private sector plus the foreign sector combined. Put another way, if the government balances its budget and the country has a trade deficit, the private sector must be going into debt. Necessarily. It is not ideology. It is arithmetic. MMT defenders argue that this explains many crises. When the United States government ran a surplus in the late 90s under Bill Clinton, the private sector accumulated debt. That private debt ended up feeding the bubble that burst in 2008. If the constraint is not money but inflation, and if there are millions of unemployed people, the government can mobilize those idle resources without generating inflationary pressure. From here comes MMT's best-known policy proposal, the job guarantee. The idea is that the government offers a job to anyone willing to work, at a base wage that becomes the effective minimum wage for the entire economy. When the private sector expands, it absorbs workers from the public program. When the private sector contracts, the program absorbs the unemployed. It works as an automatic stabilizer. During recessions, the program's spending rises because more people need it, injecting demand into the economy exactly when it is most needed. During expansions, spending falls because workers move to the private sector. Stephanie Kelton, author of The Deficit Myth and perhaps the best-known popularizer of MMT, argues that the job guarantee would make involuntary unemployment obsolete. It is not about giving away free money. It is about offering useful work to those who seek it, financed by the state's ability to create its own currency. MMT has received fierce criticism from virtually every current of economic thought. It is worth taking them seriously. The first and most frequent is the risk of inflation. Lawrence Summers, former United States Treasury Secretary, has argued that MMT gravely underestimates that risk. Saying inflation is the limit sounds reasonable in the abstract. But in practice, a serious problem arises. How does a government know it is approaching the limit before crossing it? Inflation does not switch on and off like a light. Once people expect prices to rise, that expectation feeds on itself. And stopping it can require severe recessions, as Paul Volcker demonstrated in the 1980s. The second criticism comes from Kenneth Rogoff and other economists. Their argument is that MMT ignores institutional credibility. If markets lose confidence that a government will control inflation, bad things happen. Interest rates rise. The currency depreciates. The cost of debt spirals. It does not matter that technically the government cannot go bankrupt. If nobody wants to buy its bonds, it has a very real problem. Paul Krugman, who shares some Keynesian premises with MMT, has pointed to a third weakness. MMT works better as description than as prescription. It is true that a sovereign government creates its own currency. It is true that taxes do not directly finance spending in an operational sense. But it does not follow that deficits do not matter. A large deficit affects interest rates. It affects the exchange rate. It affects expectations. Ignoring that is dangerous. MMT defenders have a powerful empirical argument: Japan. Japan has spent decades with public debt exceeding 250% of its GDP. According to conventional economics, those debt levels should have provoked a fiscal crisis, skyrocketing interest rates, or hyperinflation. None of that has happened. Japanese interest rates have been near zero for 30 years. Inflation has been persistently low, sometimes negative. MMT explains this naturally. Japan issues its own currency. Its debt is denominated in yen. The Bank of Japan can buy as much debt as it wants. A solvency crisis is impossible. But critics respond that Japan is a special case. It is a highly productive economy with enormous domestic savings. Its debt is held mostly by Japanese institutions, not foreign investors. And Japan has spent decades with anemic growth and an aging society. The absence of a crisis does not mean the model is replicable in any other country. Moreover, critics point to the opposite cases. Argentina, Turkey, Venezuela, countries with monetary sovereignty that printed money and ended up with galloping inflation. MMT responds that those countries had foreign currency debt, undiversified economies, or weak institutions. They are not valid counterexamples. The debate remains open. There is one aspect of MMT that has direct implications for Europe. Eurozone countries do not issue their own currency. Spain, Italy, Greece, and Germany use the euro, but none of them creates it. The euro is issued by the European Central Bank. According to MMT, this turns Eurozone countries into something akin to users of a foreign currency. Spain can run out of euros in the same way a company can run out of money. It does not have the ability to create the currency it uses. This explains, according to MMT theorists, why the euro crisis was so devastating. Greece could not devalue its currency. It could not print euros to pay its debts. It was trapped in a framework that denied it the tools a sovereign state would have had available. MMT does not necessarily say the euro was a mistake. But it does say that a monetary area without a real fiscal union creates structural vulnerabilities that the 2010 crisis demonstrated with brutality. The MMT debate seems abstract, but it has enormous consequences for everyday life. If MMT is right, the austerity decisions many European governments made after the 2008 crisis were unnecessary and destructive. The cuts in healthcare, education, and social services were not inevitable. They were a political choice based on a mistaken understanding of how money works. But if the critics are right, spending without limits on the assumption that inflation can be controlled afterward is a promise the most vulnerable end up paying for. Inflation is a regressive tax. It hurts most those who have least. Low-income families spend a higher percentage of their incomes on food, energy, and housing, exactly the sectors where inflation hits first. Both positions have something in common. Both acknowledge that decisions about public spending are not merely technical. They are profoundly political. And the question of how much a government can spend, for what purpose, and with what limits, is one of those that most directly affects the lives of millions of people. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, modern monetary theory holds that a state with monetary sovereignty cannot run out of money. Taxes do not fund public spending, they regulate inflation and redistribute income. The real limit on spending is not financial, but the real productive capacity of the economy. Second, the criticisms are substantial. Inflation is not controlled with a switch. Institutional credibility matters. And the experience of countries that printed money without restraint suggests the line between productive spending and an inflationary spiral is thinner than MMT acknowledges. Third, Japan seems to confirm MMT. Weimar, Venezuela, and Argentina seem to refute it. MMT responds that the circumstances were radically different. The debate is not settled, and it will probably be resolved not by theory but by the accumulation of historical experience. MMT is a new idea trying to change the world. But history is full of brilliant economic ideas that almost changed everything and then did not. Some were ahead of their time. Some were tried and failed. And some might get a second chance. Next time, the Chicago Plan, money that rusts, the Bancor that never was, and other ideas that deserve to be remembered.